In this video, you're gonna learn all about event-driven analytics from Hussain. All and more coming up. Hey there, Measure Geeks! Julian here, back with another video for you. Today we have Hussain Mehmood from Marketlytics on the channel to teach us about event-driven analytics. This is actually part of our Measure Masters live training that we do every month for our Measure Masters. And I asked Hussain to come on board to teach us about event-driven analytics. What is this all about? Well, you might know that the analytics world is changing in quite fundamental way. The way that Google Analytics, for example, tracked when it started out was mainly websites and page views. Now that model obviously changed with mobile devices or other kind of businesses that wanted to use analytics, but they didn't really have page views, sessions, and user data, but they still wanted to get the benefit of analytics. Google Analytics, in that case, was a bit rigid from a system. They made a lot of decisions up front in order to serve a large customer base, but that customer base is now changing. Previously, tools like Mixpanel were pretty niche, but nowadays they become more popular because they have an event-driven model. What does this mean? Well, if you don't have page views anymore, then you could take an event, for example, and make it completely free what you want to send into the system in order to analyze your data. Now, for instance, Google Analytics already has announced the next version of Google Analytics, which is the app and web property, where only event-driven data is actually used. That way, they can cover much more in terms of the use cases that Google Analytics App plus Web would be used for. You can use it for website, mobile apps, e-commerce stores, games, or a directory, for example. This makes it obviously much more universal, but at the same time, it brings a whole new data model that we need to understand, the event-driven analytics data model. So I've invited my friend Hussain, who runs the analytics consultancy Marketlytics, to teach us about this new event-driven world, as he sees a lot of clients who they set up analytics infrastructure for to explain to them the event-driven world, but then also model their data and their business cases towards these new tools and this new world of event-driven analytics. Now, before we get started, we had lots to cover in this conversation. Down below, we have timestamps if you want to skip forward to one or the other question that interests you most. And I also have the link down below to Marketlytics if you want to check out the consultancy that Hussain runs. Okay, enough talking. We got lots to cover. Let's dive in. Hey there, and welcome to another Measure Master live training. My name is Julian. Today we have a guest, Hussain Mehmood, who is going to talk about how we can get started with event-driven analytics. You see his slide here already. So let me quickly introduce Hussain here. So Hussain, we have met years ago already, right? Virtually online, and last year we saw each other in person in Berlin. So Hussain is running the analytics agency. Do you call it analytics agency? Marketlytics?
Yeah, consultancy agency, yes.
Consultancy agency. Yeah, it's a kind of interesting field because we are consulting, but we're also doing stuff hands-on. So it's a kind of a mixture. And we have actually been working with Hussain and his team for a long time. So anytime you put in a service request, they actually jump in and help me out to fulfill all these services that we offer at Measure School. And he has been a long-time partner for us and does really great work. So I'm really happy to have him on today. Hussain, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit more about Marketlytics and what your experience is, because I know you have a lot of experience in the analytics field.
Yep. Thanks, Julian. Thank you for the invite. So I started, pretty early on with just trying to figure out how to improve ads. But when I kind of went in to kind of do that, I found out that there's actually no data to improve them. So I kind of stumbled my way into Google Analytics and then liked that world a lot more. So I just, kind of started to specialize in it. So I've been consulting with analytics for about 10 years now. Started building Marketlytics, almost as soon as I sort of started, because I was studying business school and they always told you to have a brand. So I thought, I'll just name Marketlytics and then, use that. And right now we are about 25 people. We do analytics consulting predominantly in kind of North America, collaborate with Julian, which I'm always kind of excited about, and a few other companies in like rest of the world as well. We have a mix of like a lot of kind of Google Analytics experience, but more recently, we've been doing a lot of work with event-driven analytics and Google Cloud, and just sort of figuring out how to kind of get all the data in one place and use it. So I'm excited to talk about some of the things that we've discovered since.
Yes, great. Thanks. I don't want to keep you too long. I'm excited about your presentation. You given it already at Super Week, and I wanted to give it here a little bit more space because every Measure Master can also learn from that as well. And maybe, yeah, just share your screen, and then we can just jump into the presentation.
So my kind of background, and kind of how I got into it was primarily through sort of user behavior and just like figuring out like what people want and how to do it. I've also been like a big fan of Measure School for a while. So this is us kind of meeting for the first time, I think, a couple of years ago. So I've sort of learned a lot from this community as well. So I'll dig into our topic and kind of talk about some of the things that we want to cover in this. I struck out a few things that I thought were a little bit more advanced, but feel free to kind of ping me about them, and I'd be happy to answer. So majorly, what we want to talk about today is the idea of events and how they're structured. And one of my kind of approaches to this is like how should you have like opinions about different things and make sure that you're consistent with your opinions as you collect data. So this is one of my kind of grounding principles when I am building something, that you build a framework and then you stick to it rather than changing things midway, because that causes a lot of problems. And then we'll talk about raw data and a lot of these other things down the line. The goal really is to sort of introduce you to these concepts, and you'll be surprised that you actually know a lot of these already. So our goal really is to just hammer in these concepts a bit more and make sure that you have a solid foundation. Cool. So let's dig into it. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is this string that you see on the page right now. So typically, these are what's called web logs. So what used to happen was that previously, whenever you loaded a page, if you had like your server set up, it would give you this sort of information about the entire thing. So it would be things like the IP address of where the person came from, information about what page was being loaded, which browser they were loading it from, and all these things. And what Google Analytics did was, and which was very smart, the original version of Google Analytics called Urchin basically converted this into a more readable format and built reports on top of it. So that's where we actually all started. And right now, if you look at Google Analytics, and if you've ever used the debugger, you actually notice the sent beacon thing, where you have all of these parameters in the in the network request that are being sent to Google Analytics. So this is actually a pretty direct kind of correlation from this that kind of converted into this over time, because over time Google has added more things that they want to track, and browsers have become better, so they've collected a lot more information. And if you're familiar with things like measurement protocol, these are also how you send hits into Google Analytics from the server as well. So my kind of point with this is that journey, even though things have evolved, the foundations have still sort of stayed the same, and that's like a strong benefit for us and like the technology, because everything like the old things journey exists, they've just been improved. Cool. So let's sort of break down what exists in this thing, right? So if you look at one hit, there's a bunch of different information as different parameters in the in the URL that are being, or in the network requests that are being sent. And the key things that we are interested in right now are this user identifier, which tells us, which is the client ID, of course, which tells us where the person, who that person is, how can we sort of connect all of their information together. Then the hit type, which is basically tells us like what type of data is being sent. And then everything else is basically some sort of a property or an event that is being sent. The idea of those particular things here is that you're telling Google Analytics a bunch of information that you have about the user directly from their browser, and then Google Analytics is sort of making sense of it on top of it, and then as a result you sort of see these reports, right? So basically, what happens is you have this pipeline, and analytics.js and ga.js and all these things sort of sit at the collection step. This is where we just send this information to Google Analytics, and then that data goes into this entire processing pipeline, right, where it gets converted into into the reports that you end up seeing at the end. So this configuration and processing step is super critical, but it's also sort of the, you know, I would say the secret sauce that Google has in making sure that it understands what sort of information we need, and then make more accessible reports out of it, right? And here, if you notice, the logs thing is still there, right? So the log is the initial request that comes through, and then it gets processed and transformed before you use it. So if you think of it this way, typically what we've all been doing is looking at just the end result of this pipeline that has existed for a very long time. And what event-driven analytics have now kind of made us able to do is that we're just able to kind of peek behind the curtain. So the logs itself are actually, conceptually very similar to events. So each log has like a few things that make it very, very, some few key things that make it very, simple to understand. But then everything else is like additional context that you could use to sort of, segment the data, or make dimensions out of it. So events have always been around. We've just sort of not used them for a bit, and now that we have actually more processing power, more storage, we can actually kind of go back and use them much faster, right? And then for each of these events, you typically have properties which are the dimension that we just looked at in Google Analytics as well, that are just converting those things to for more context. Cool. Yeah, Julian, if you can feel like any questions come up, or if you have anything, feel free to stop me, because yeah, I would prefer to kind of answering them in the middle as well.
Okay.
Cool.
Not quite yet. We don't have.
All right. Awesome. Yeah. So I think this is the fundamental kind of model that I'd love for you guys to think about. Is conceptually, Google Analytics is just a summary of your, of these logs, and these logs are journey events, right? So when we think about events, you should just think about having more kind of raw, or like direct access to the underlying data, rather than having it processed. And then what that gives you is that it's basically a way for you to kind of get more control over that data, right? So now let's define an event and what it is, right? An event is effectively one observation, or one thing that you measure at any given time, right? It's journey linked to an activity. So anything that has like a discrete activity kind of stream to it, could be considered an event. It also, for our purposes, has to have one identifier. So the identifier could be a client ID, which is anonymous, but it still tells us there's one user, or hopefully one user, and then it tells us a lot of other things about that time as well. And it's also very self-contained. So it's only what it tells us really is that it's very much of a snapshot in time, right? So it only tells us what happens at that time and moment in time. So it's just that record of activity, but it doesn't really tie into everything else. This is where this idea of this user ID comes in, and our ability to sort of actually connect a lot of these dots together based off like other things comes in, right? And then in most cases it's very standalone. So each event could be independently done. This is what you have in Google Analytics terms. It would be a hit, right? So each hit is sort of separate. It doesn't really have any context about what happens afterwards. All of that processing happens within the tool, right? So once you have the logs, Google Analytics processes it. Cool. So that's where we start. So we now have the ability to get events, and events have become sort of major part of like more of the larger companies are doing, because what they've realized is that even though Google Analytics is great, you need more flexibility, and the type of questions that you need to answer, you need to be able to kind of go back and re-review the data that was collected. Cool. So now I'd love to sort of just break down the what exists in an event and how to kind of think about them. One of the first things, of course, is the action. So this is the activity that actually happened. In this case, for example, someone clicking on a button could be an activity. Someone starting or viewing a page is also an activity. Someone submitting a form is an activity. So all of these are actions. But what you'd sort of notice very quickly is that actions without like context about what was happening in that action is not really that useful. So you could have things like, each action could be like very, very specific. So it could be, submitted my contact form or submitted my demo form, but we'll talk about why this is not like a great pattern. Cool. So the next thing you of course have is properties. So properties is the additional context or information that you have about events. They give you this ability to segment the data, break it down, or specify a smaller group of things that you want to look at. So in the standard kind of Google Analytics terms, if you look at it, it would be properties would be things like a dimension could be used as a property to segment things, right? But if you have the event structure, you have event category, action, and label. You could think of the category as maybe the action, and then the label and action as like other things that you sort of know about these things. But you'll notice that of course there's limit to it, right? You could not really do a lot of these properties in the current structure. Then the third, if you look at this kind of context here, we have the event and then the properties. If you look at like an order completed event, these might be some of the properties that you want to collect. And of course, there could be others as well, depending on who, what sort of information you have in your system. But for order completed, I would imagine that these are the minimums that you collect, right? So you have order ID, total, source, discount, shipping, product IDs. There could be multiples, of course, product name as well. And if you map this to Google Analytics, you have things like you have the transaction hit, which actually collects a lot of these pieces as well. Cool. So yeah, so typically each of these things would have some sort of a context that you would use. And finally, you have an actor. So the idea of the actor is that it's typically the user that is performing the action, but it necessarily does not always have to be the user, right? So you can think of certain cases like if you're a B2B business, your actor might be the business itself, and then the person that's actually doing it might be a sub actor within that field. So hierarchically, you as a business is interested in understanding maybe how many businesses have an account with me, right? Versus like how many users that each of those businesses have. So conceptually, you should also think of the actor as the performer of the event that you're interested in understanding. Cool. And yeah, of course, Tom Cruise, a famous actor. I generally just remember it by that. And if you remember performers of actors, typically that makes it so that you are very consciously thinking about, who do I want the action to be performed by? Cool. Yeah. So just a summary of things that we just talked about. The one kind of additional note would be that you always do not need to know some personally identifiable information about the actor. It could be just an anonymous person as well, right? As long as there's a way to just kind of keep track of all their activity together, it's an acceptable use case for an ID, right? In other cases, it could be that there could be multiple actors involved in a transaction. So if you think of, let's say, someone some place like Airbnb, where you have a person that's renting their house and then another person that's actually going to stay there. There's actually two people, and any action being done is actually impacting two persons, right? So it's a very advanced concept, but in some cases there could be multiple people impacted. So what you should do is you should record activity for both of those parties, in different ways. Cool. And that's all on the actors front. And then if we talk about the last thing, which is, I think, very super critical and gets missed, is time, right? So everything that we're capturing has a certain time at which it occurred. And that time necessarily, does not always have to be the time when we actually get the event, right? So if you are on a mobile device, a lot, and you're offline, your events might get, delayed and, get there later and so forth. So remembering time and remembering like local time of the user versus like the time that your service is up is very important when you're thinking about events. Cool. So yeah, so there's a few different time related things that we should just talk about, right? So machines are always tracking time. So anything that you do in any system has like some idea of time, right? And time is something that gets changed depending on the context. So if my local time right now is about 2 p.m., Julian is probably like at 2 hours before me or something, right? So there's like everyone sort of has their own time, and then if we were collecting information right now about all of you guys, and you watching this stream, we would want to standardize time, because otherwise, like that would not make sense in terms of the events that are happening, right? And one of the things to remember from the tool perspective is that changing the data once it's processed and the time, is pretty much impossible, because all of these systems have almost have built it in a way that it's like impossible to change these things because they get processed so much. Uh, and but if we store time, as timestamps in our events, then we have more flexibility in reprocessing it, outside of the tool. So if anyone of you has ever lost any e-commerce transactions and wanted to kind of push them back to the right date, that it's impossible to kind of reprocess it for a given time because the data has already been processed. Cool. Then yeah, so I personally like to sort of think of this as like life as a series of events, right? So you conceptually are doing one thing after the other, and then all of those actions are not like worth measuring, but it makes it so that it's like a little bit technically speaking, it's like a little bit simpler to think of every journey that you're going through as number of events and steps that are happening. Cool. And we'll basically take an example to talk about how we can sort of think of these series of events, right? So let's imagine that Julian is going to announce a measure school conference somewhere, and then we want to sort of talk about, like, I'm luckily enough to be invited to kind of present at that conference, right? So this is like a sort of series of events that I would go through to actually make it to the conference, right? So I get invited, I apply for the visa, I receive visa. I come from Pakistan, so the visa is a big deal for us. In other countries, it might not be, right? And then I book a flight, I board a flight, and then I sort of go through these things, and finally I would speak at the conference. Uh, Thankfully this is virtual, so I can skip a lot of these steps, but still, sort of the same things apply, right? If we look at it from the other perspective, right? So if we look at it from the perspective of the measure school, kind of the live conference that they want to do, these might be the series of things that would happen, right? So they would invite some speaker, they would receive a reply, they would get a confirmation. Maybe like they pick the person from the hotel, from the airport, and brought them to the venue. And then let's say in this case, like I was originally sort of talking about Super Week, so we kind of arrive at Super Week, and then we talk about it here as well, right? So this, like, the idea is that some of these things actually overlap with what I would do, and somewhat with these would be things that Measure School would have to do, or the organizer of the conference would have to do. But like each of them would sort of look at the data from their perspective. And if we have sort of the third thing, if I'm actually booking a flight and I use Emirates.com as an example, this is the journey that they would see. So this is like, I view the flight, I book a flight, I board the flight, and I complete it. Some of these things, I think, as a digital analyst, we are very used to seeing, like viewing a flight and booking a flight. But boarding and completed are more like business-related things, right? Which do not really come to us. But if we could, it would actually complete the journey in a lot more detail. Cool. So yeah, so this is like conceptually to think of as like there's overlap between events, but given the context of business and the person that's using those events, they could mean very different things, and we should try to think of those things, in that context. All right, awesome. And then yeah, this is, I think, the key kind of learning from this. You should always try to map the events to the journey of the user and how they are going through it, and that makes it so that you actually discover blockers and endpoints, and it's a very good way to even understand how a business is used by their customers and what they benefit from. Cool. So now let's rewrite this Google Analytics hit that we were talking about earlier, right? In this context of the event thing that we've talked about, right? So in this case, the hit type actually becomes the type of the event, and it would be page view, right? And then you have a lot of properties that tell you about this page, right? So you have things like content groups, dimensions. This is from our website. This is data that we collect. You of course have the location, which is the URL of that page. You have the title of that page. Then you have metadata, like browser related things, like screen colors, resolution, and all these things. And this is what gets processed into the reports that we typically look at, right? And the idea is that it already exists there, and then we're just changing it, right? And then if we add more things to it, you effectively then have this kind of idea. You have this context that you're providing, then there's a machine related context which comes automatically from the page, and then there's the collection thing which tells us, this is the tracking ID that you should be sending data to, and this is the API version and other things that could be used for debugging in the future. Cool. And then, of course, last but not least, you have a client ID, which is a required parameter, which tells you, this is the user, and if I come back, I'll be identified again. And then I also have a timestamp, which comes from just my event being sent, and that information that gets processed, alongside everything else. Cool. So yeah, so that's the idea behind the events and the structure, right? I think hopefully you're able to actually use this concept now much better and think of what you already do with Google Analytics as, a series of events that happen. The only thing to remember is that they're very standardized because, there's a set finite number of options and properties that you can pass through, but it's still very customizable if you wanted to. Cool. So one kind of last kind of thing to remember, with the events before we dive into like more some of the best practices, is that typically when we talk about an action or an event, we are not really kind of observing the action, right? Where we are basically using a proxy that someone that clicked on a button wanted to click on it, or hovered over something wanted to do it. So it's like it's an assumption based off like our ability to track things. So one thing that I generally kind of talk to customers about is do not really assume some like if something is happening that there's only one reason that's happening. So always think about the action as like our understanding of how we can track something. It's not necessarily what the customer wants to do or is trying to achieve. But yeah, it's a good proxy, and that's why I think over the last kind of 20 years, more people have tried started to use it. Cool. Right. So I think let's talk about what a good event looks like, right? Because everyone sort of asks me things like some kind of quality about events and bounce rates and all these things, and I'm always trying to sort of put them in context. In my opinion, with events, these like in most cases, or in almost all cases, events would have these four things. So you would always get a timestamp, you would always get an actor, you would always get some metadata about where the event was happening, and you would get like some properties that would tell you more context about the events. So this context alongside the action that is happening is critical, right? All of these things are part of the context, but making sure that you are very conscious about collecting them is important. One thing that I've seen in the past people do is they ignore the metadata context because it's not something that they imagine they'll use right away. But if you in a lot of cases, if you get stuck, it's a very good way to debug things. If I know certain additional information about the browser, or what the settings were on that machine and so forth. So collecting them from the start is very important. And then I think the other thing to be very important is like with metadata, you generally want to be very consistent, so you can actually see certain changes that you could use to debug things. Similarly with properties as well, you want to be exhaustive without being like overbearing, because the problem is everything that you collect has a cost, right? So you can't really just try to collect everything, because it would require integrations into systems, getting data out, putting things into the data layer that your tools can read. And it's important to just think of them from like a cost benefit perspective. But the major ones that you have, you should always sort of try to collect. Cool. So here's an example of a bad versus or better event, as I say it, right? So as I originally talked about, you have events that could be very, very specific. You could have form submitted contact, form submitted demo, and all these things. But what makes it difficult with this is that it's very hard to compare between different types of form submissions. And it's easier to actually have a form submitted event and then break it down by the type of form or form name, versus like trying to just filter and select each of these events individually. So yeah, so think about like a general category which is similar, where you'd want to do comparisons and use that as your kind of starting point, right? And then you'd collect like additional properties as part of that equation that you can then use. So as an example, if you had demo form on like 5 pages, the page URL property would help you find like split the demo form into like 3 in all the pages that they were used on, and look at that way. But if you did not, then it would just be like 5 events, and it would be harder to compare them. and it would be harder to sort of break them down further. But there's something like even better, right? So what you could do is you could actually have even better events. So one of the things that you should remember, and this is again sort of metadata that you would generally not use, is things like form ID, right? So anything that could potentially change. So you could have a form name, and it could be named contact one day and inquiry the other, right? So that could change. You would really want things that are more reliable and they don't change very often, because that makes it so that you can sort of pick data up and join things if you if you change the names as well. So if you for example, if you set up something on WordPress, Gravity Form or Contact Form 7 is a very common form plugin. We would always want to collect the form ID that these platforms give us in addition to the form name and the URL. And that makes it so that even if I as a user change the name of that form, the ID does not really change, and I could keep kind of track of it. Cool. And then the other thing really is about naming things, right? So naming, I think, is super critical because it's one of the things that you're going to actually get exposed to a lot. Whatever data you collect, the only way to discover it is through how it's been named and defined. So I think this is a step that gets missed very often, because you generally want to jump very eagerly into doing the actual implementation, and then as part of that you sort of skip the thinking about what your events should look like and what the names should be. And that makes it very, very time consuming for the analyst or for you to analyze the data once you're actually going to start using it. And so thinking about the naming, thinking about the properties that you're going to collect are super critical. And then if you name them correctly, what it helps people do, and this like mostly psychological, is people have a very good tendency to pick up patterns. So if things are named similarly or consistent, it just makes it faster for them to kind of understand what these things are, and then use them more quickly, versus like trying to look up definitions and all of these things. So yeah, so always be very consistent, even if it feels like you're being awkward because it's not like the standard way of you speak. Just make sure that you pick one pattern and use it. These are the two patterns that I like, right? So this is the object plus action and action plus object. So you have order purchased versus like purchased order. I personally prefer the object plus action model, and one of the reasons for this is if you have any drop downs, in most cases your things are organized by alphabetical order, right? So if you have object plus action, so if I had order purchased, order viewed, order started, order added to cart, all of these would sort of get grouped into would sort of be in one order. So if I'm trying to pick things and compare them, I'm just able to find them much easily, versus I'm typing purchased order and then added to cart order and all these other things, which makes it just a bit slower. So that's just sort of my one tip to think about. But conceptually you can do either of them, as long as you're consistent. It still is a better outcome. uh, right. And the last thing I do, and this is like mostly kind of personal, is I prefer to use past tense, because every action that we're observing or looking at has been already has been completed already, right? So I use past tense because of that, just to sort of keep my my namespace kind of thinking about those things. But that's again like a personal choice. Like regardless of what choices you make, you just make sure that once you've made them, you document them somewhere, and then people can continue to follow them rather than like change them midway. Cool. And then on documenting things, this is how we typically document. So we generally use Google Sheets quite a lot. We've built a few automations on top of it, but we effectively have the event, the property, where it's coming from, like, if it's coming from GTM or Segment or some other platform, when it gets triggered, and what type of data comes from it, all in one place. And that makes it so that, the information is more readily, usable and available, and someone new can actually very easily kind of copy them. Cool. And then we come to sort of app plus web, which is I'm sure everyone's sort of heard of it right now. But if not, this is the new version of Google Analytics that's going to become the default standard in maybe a year or two. And what they've done there as well is they've defined like a standard schema of how to name the events, and then what sort of parameters or properties to pass with those events, right? And this is, I think, a great step in the right direction, because by making these things consistent, they've standardized these things. And the added benefit of like their standardization is that they're going to give you some out of the box reports which would use these parameters. So if you have those parameters, this becomes more usable in the future. Uh, But yeah, effectively, that sort of is the idea. You should, think of extending or using this as the starting point, and maybe extending them if you need to, but try to kind of, stay close to the platforms and their recommendations, or your own approach to how you want to kind of model the data, and then, just kind of keep at it. Cool. So yeah, I think this is like a common question when we talk about events that comes up, right? I already have this great analytics platform. Why do I need events, right? So what is the benefit of having this event level data versus like what I already have right now? And I think it's a very fair question, right? Because you as a person, should not really be trying to implement every new cool feature. Even though I personally do that a lot because I just enjoy doing it. From a business perspective, your goal is to sort of use the data and find ways to apply it. So I think like conceptually thinking about events is that if you're starting with scratch, events is a very good way to kind of foolproof things, right? And on the other side, if you have events, then it just makes it so that your journey able to refer to things much, like you can sort of reuse them in a lot of different ways than you could not with Google Analytics. So those would be sort of my kind of key points to it. But yeah, for each person, you should always think about. I generally say that you should always be thinking about 20% of your time should be going to the implementation, and then 80% of it should be actually using the data. So if you don't have a lot of time, do not try to do and track everything. Just measure the thing that's important, and then try to improve based off of that, and then hopefully the benefit of that would give you more time to kind of go back and apply more things. Cool. So this is like a more kind of opinionated way of thinking of it, right? So each tool that you use has like some strong opinions, and they dictate those opinions through the interfaces and reports that they let you build. So from that perspective, events is your way of like breaking out of that shell, because you have the flexibility of using those events for for changing or processing the data in the way that you want, right? So that's my kind of recommendation of like thinking about events and considering them. But yeah, if you're a small company that's just starting, or just starting to think about these things, these are not prime considerations in some cases. And this might be like a politically incorrect opinion, but the like some of these things are better because these like they give you kind of guardrails in terms of like how to kind of you do things, so you don't have to worry about like spending a lot of time implementing best practices. Cool. And this is like my major reasons for loving or really liking the events, because I as a person get exposed to a lot of business problems, and I'm always eager to solve them. And this gives me the most flexibility and being in ability to kind of solve those problems, right? And you can always summarize the events to create the reports that Google Analytics gives you, but you can never like break that down to have like more granular data, right? So that's like one of the major reasons that you should, like, if you expect to have like a lot of data, then you should consider events. And then user behavior data, of course, is fickle, right? If I'm not measuring something right now, it's not something that I can recreate. So if you come to my website and I do not have Google Analytics, I do not know what you did, right? Or if I do not have an analytics platform, you cannot tell what the person did, and you cannot recreate it. So events is just one very kind of generalized way of collecting that data that you can then reuse and use later on. Cool. So I think this is then sort of the common question, right? How do I actually get raw data, and where does it come from? So we're sort of shifting from our typical events that we were talking about so far, which were things like something that you would collect from your website, to also like other places where you have a lot of user behavior data that could be used as events, right? So if you think of your CRMs, your email platforms, your ad platforms, they all are collecting some sort of information in different ways. Not all of this is actually in the form of events, right? But you can conceptually think of them in general terms from like an event perspective. So I think like a common example would be if you think of email, and if you have a platform like ActiveCampaign, they would track like email, email sent, opens, clicks. So each of them is like a discrete action that was done by a user. So you can actually use that for thinking about events as well. Similarly, of course, like you have mobile assets, you have app plus web, where you can get like a raw stream of events as well now. And there's other older platforms, and then you have you can actually build your own platforms. So Simo, I'm sure everyone knows. This is like Mark Edmondson, who's another kind of cool guy. They built like a way to actually get data directly into Google BigQuery using basically Google Tag Manager and some Google Cloud functions. So it's a very cool way to actually build your own kind of database of events. It's not something that I would recommend to everyone, but like conceptually it is possible, right? And like for collecting data where it's already in platforms, we have things like Stitch and Fivetran and Google Cloud Functions, which is like a more managed way of like getting data from, let's say, ActiveCampaign or Salesforce, for example, and then putting it into the same place or into the same database. All right, awesome. So this is an example of like some of the data that we've collected recently, right? So each of this is like actually one row in our Google BigQuery table for some of our clients, right? And don't worry, these phone numbers and everything is like test data, but the idea here is that you can actually get like one blob of data where it's where I can sort of extract more information out of it as I need to, right? And this other bit is like we're getting some data from the front end, so we're capturing the you know the source medium and campaign from that data as well, and that also sort of comes from the same kind of stream. So yeah, so it's relatively it's become relatively simpler to do that now versus like maybe like a couple of years ago even. So I would encourage anyone who's like interested to sort of experiment with this and see how they do. Cool. And then yeah, I think the question then is like, how do you actually manage the data and get value from it, right? So I think this is like probably a very growing area of interest within our community as well. But it's still very early days for it, right? So Google's App plus Web is really a bet in that we're going to move in that direction, right? And I think Google's sort of saying is like we understand that we can give you reports, but raw data is also important. So we're going to help you collect it. So App plus Web, of course, has a way to collect raw data as well. Cool. Sorry, I think my phone just Google like listened to Google and did OK Google on me. So, so yeah, so like that. So the idea there is that, of course, like you have other tools that make it so that you can get value out of these events without having to do the processing or calculations on top of that data yourself. So you have things like Amplitude and Mixpanel, which have been around for a bit longer than App plus Web, that give you this flexibility of building user level funnels, tracking like cohort analysis and churn and other things, which require the events, plus they require like a user ID that stays with you longer term. So it's not just the client ID, but it would technically be like something like your internal customer ID of that user or something, right? And BigQuery and Snowflake are more general purpose databases that allow you to do petabyte scale, data collection, and then not have to manage the infrastructure itself. So they are like more enterprise level tools that we use for like very large companies. But if you're someone that's just getting started, I would recommend starting with one of the first three tools. Amplitude also has a pretty good free tier as well. App plus Web is of course like completely free, and Mixpanel also like gives you some free things. Then the other side of that is, of course, like how do you actually collect this data in like simpler ways? So here, of course, you have like two sort of very well-known tools. Google Tag Manager can actually help you get this sort of data into your systems as well, because Tag Manager is just a way to pass data along and just make it simple. Segment.com is another platform that lets you do it. Both of them like have like conceptually different approaches to the same thing, but they end up like letting you collect raw events or any sort of like structured sort of event-based data where you have some name of the property and some value into a database or into a platform, one of the above platforms. And then on the other side you have dbt and airflow. These are more advanced tools that you'd use with things like BigQuery to process your data and kind of organize it and model it and so forth. The benefit of like these last two tools is that you can like really build it once and then reuse it very often. So if you have a common calculation or a common process that you have to go through, you can bring data from not only your front end kind of user behavior or your digital activity, but also maybe from your CRM or from your email platform, and then combine it all together to do like more advanced calculations and analysis of that data. Cool. And this is an example of something that we do through dbt. So we actually process the data in multiple steps depending on where the data is coming from, convert it, transform it, and then finally we have the report that we use. And this is, of course, like this uses SQL and like other things that we use to process the data. And these are all of you might have sort of seen some of these. So Calendly, of course, is like a platform for booking booking appointments. You have Facebook ads, you have CallRail, and these things are then sort of brought in together and like joined in with other data sources and with each other to actually build these sort of reports. So this is like an advanced use case that you could do if if you need like an answer that you can't get directly from a platform. But in most cases, you would really use this if you have cases where you have like if your questions actually span multiple multiple kind of domains, right? So if you're trying to answer a question about user behavior, then you probably do not need all of these other things and a data warehouse. But if you're talking about trying to connect ROI from your ad platforms all the way to if some demo converted into a into an actual sale that happens in your CRM, then these sort of things would make more sense because they can get you the data from all of these places in one place. All right, and then this is sort of the idea, right? So once we model the data, you actually get all of these attributes together, and then here we have like the first and last touches, but we not only have paid touches, but we've also sort of done the like if you notice last campaign as well, right? So there could be differences in attribution based off like how you want to model that data and understand it. In Google Analytics terms, this would really be very hard to do because you'd have to detect like what is a paid source, what is not like a paid source very early on in the process, and then hard code all of these things on the front end of your website. Maybe you can have Google Tag Manager, and it could tell you that if there's CPC, use this other custom dimension. If there's medium is not CPC, then use another dimension. But it does not give you that flexibility after the fact because in this case we can change our definition whenever we want and include or exclude something from a paid source, or consider what we want to use as the paid touch or the last touch pretty much on our own. So it's a lot more flexibility, and that comes with, of course, like some technical complexity that you have to process the data. But once you have it, and once you have like a good use case, this is really powerful. Cool. And then I think the last bit that we did not touch on, but is like a very important concept in Google Analytics and in Journey, like event-driven analytics as well, is user attributes, right? So typically, if you've used custom dimensions, you know that in Google Analytics you have different scopes and different levels of detail where you can associate things. So you have the user level scope where anything that you send to Google Analytics would then be used for will be available as an attribute for every action that happens afterwards in that session or in any subsequent session. Or you have session based scope where the property that you would pass in would get used by all the activity that happened in that particular session. And then you have hit level where it's more like an event property. It would just be available with the action that that was used to pass it through. But with events, the flexibility is that you don't have to worry about setting these user attributes early on, because what you could conceptually do is once you have the properties, you can mark them as something that you want to care about and remember, right? So you can actually just pick them out from the raw data in the future. But this is not something that some of these tools would let you do, right? So in most analytics platforms, including App Plus Web or Amplitude, you typically would still need to explicitly tell the analytics platform when you're collecting data that these are the user properties and these are my event properties. So there's of course like some level of advantage that they get from that, because they don't have to separate out the data after the fact. But if you're doing it in your own database, then anything that you want could be a user property in the future. So this is, I think, a very powerful concept. It's and I think there's a lot of use cases because you can go back and look at something and use it as like some other context later on. But technically, you should think about things that you want to remember and things that you expect to have value beyond just the event in which they happen. So any action, anything like date of sign up, or some demographic attribute like gender, etc. Is useful not only when you collect it, but also for future events. So you should try to store them as user attributes as such. Cool. And this is actually some common calculations and things that you do with the events, right? So once you've collected this data, I think the common question, of course, is like, what do I actually get to do with it, right? And if you notice at this list, in most cases in Google Analytics and in other places, uh, you're already seeing metrics that are based off these calculations. So count of things is a total events is basically a very good example of it. Total page views is also an example of a count of hit type page view, right? So those things are being done. You have averages and sums, for other properties. The first and latest properties, of course, is something that's not commonly done in Google Analytics. But if you think of multi-channel funnels, there's like the traffic source has like first and last and like everything in the middle, right? And then you have other ways actually of thinking of these things like uniques and unique list counts, right? So these are more kind of advanced concepts. But for example, if you wanted to see what are all the different things that a customer has purchased from me, you'd want something like a unique list. If you wanted to see what is the last product they purchased, that would be a latest property value, right? Or what was the first campaign they came through, that would be a first property value. And then unique list count would be something like if they've purchased like hundreds of products, and they've purchased only three, like what is the count of those products? So yeah, so these are the reason I generally like this sort of thing is that it makes it so that you have conceptually a very simple way of thinking of like what sort of calculations and use cases I could kind of drive out of that data, right? And then the last bit, of course, is that you have when am I doing these calculations? Am I looking at all the history of a user, or am I looking at like a window of time for that user? So what like I think with user behavior data, one of the things that I've noticed is things over time lose value, because if someone was interested in something 3 months ago, it's not necessarily that they would be interested in the same thing now, right? So there's so doing these calculations and knowing what is my buyer's life cycle, and how much time do they take to kind of do these things is very important, because you can then sort of get the data for the right context and the right time. Cool. This is like a common question that I ask everyone. So what is the most common identifier that you can think of, right? So with identifiers, I think one of the things that we have to understand is, in the ecosystem that we live in, we have marketing data, we have our internal data, we have other places where they collect data. And in most cases, all of these things have their own way of identifying the same record, right? So what that causes us to do is, like, if I wanted to connect all the activity of that user together, I'm then going to struggle, because there's no way to kind of know it's the same person, right? And technically, from sort of the work that we've done over the last like 3 or 4 years, we've come to the understanding that like the most reliable identifier is something like an email address, right? Because the email address is something that most platforms would collect, and it's also something that's like available readily, right? Given sort of privacy concerns, you may not always want to collect the email address, but what you could do is you could actually use that as a proxy to hash it, or uh, encrypt it. So that way, it becomes hashing is actually better than encryption, because you can't really reverse it, you know, not yet at least, right? Maybe supercomputers could, but the idea is that you use an ID that is standardized across all of these platforms, so you can in the future join the data together. So it's a very important consideration to have, because even though the actor is the same, there's from a computer perspective, you need a very good way to find and connect those things together. Cool. And then, yeah, these are some of the user level things that you can think about in terms of like what are the calculations that I could do once I have events. If I can connect all of my data together, I could consider things like lifetime value. How much time does it take for someone to purchase or purchase again? Like what is my first source, last source before a certain action like purchase or demo or inquiry, cancellation, moment of value, maybe when was the last thing they, when they enjoyed doing it, maybe downloaded something, completed an article or whatever. So there's like, I think the idea is that once you collect event level data and you have, users, identifiers, some like time becomes very important, because you could then look at a very long user journey versus just like a very small window of time. Cool. And then this is some of the common data sets that you're going to encounter in this area, right? So CRM is like one of your data sets. Products, of course, is another common data set if you're an e-commerce site, but without beyond products as well, if you're offering some sort of services, you could think of each of those services as a product as well. Then you have your ad data, which comes from different ad platforms. You have your user behavior data about people buying and learning, so user behavior data as well. And then if you blend all of them together, then that's where events come in, because it's a very common, simplified way of collecting all of these pieces of information. Cool. So these are like some of the more advanced use cases that we've been doing with this sort of data, right? They require more information than just one platform. So they're very good use cases for collecting this sort of data. If you're thinking of some of these use cases, then it might be useful to think of events as well, right? So recommendation systems. This could be things like recommending another product, recommending the next piece of content, recommending the next marketing treatment that should be done for some user, like what is the next ad to show someone, right? These are all things that you could do using this system. So this personalizes the experience of the user based off the things that they've done. In the past, we used to do this like very broadly. So we used to like bucket users based off their age or gender or city and use it. But in our experience so far, this sort of personalization has more impact because it's it's very dependent on their situation versus their environment, right? So this is like what they want to do versus like what exists around them. So it's generally like more personalized that way, and people have respond better to it, right? You can do like product feed things where you have your own, let's say, stock inventory, and then you have maybe like a product ad that's running on Facebook, right? And then you could use that plus the behavior to actually trigger certain things, or like block an ad from running if the stock runs out. Or even like a very advanced use case is like you could alert your vendor of the stock shortage if you expect an increase in your user behavior, right? So if you see like someone looking at an ad, looking at pages a lot more often, like the product page, and based off previous data, you can predict that there's going to be a surge in purchase of this product. You could then do something around like stocking up on that inventory so you don't run out. So a very advanced use case, this uses data from your order management system, your front end data, maybe your ad platform data as well. But could be really beneficial, if you're running something that's like very time limited or something, right? And the last bit, of course, is customer 360. This is something that I think a lot of people have focused on. I think this is a good use case because it gives you like a good understanding of everything. But I think this is only really useful if you have actionability on top of this, right? So if you only collect this and look at a dashboard and don't do anything from it, it's it's okay, but it's not really going to change the business, right? So so typically I would say even if it's less accurate, but you get like a good view of the data, that's a good starting point. But you should then try to invest more of that time into actually figuring out how I actually use that insight into some some line of my business. Cool. And then, yes, some sort of learnings that we've had over the years, right? So right now, because like events are becoming more important for a few technical reasons. One of them is, of course, that it's becoming a lot cheaper to store that data, right? So you can store like gigabytes or petabytes of data for very low cost on things like Google Cloud, right? And then the processing of that data is very fast. So BigQuery can process like terabytes of data in seconds, right? So it's very it's very much possible now for people without like a lot of upfront investment in infrastructure instead of doing it, right? Then the idea that it's like a common structure, it's something that is very discrete and very simple. It could be applied to a lot of different data sets, and you can use that to sort of join things together. It's reusable as well. It could be transformed because anything that's raw could like be upgraded to like more summary and stats, but it cannot be like broken down, right? And then like last bits, of course, is you're think like you should as a business have like some opinions about like what I want this data to do and like how I want to collect it. And it's okay to like agree with the platform, and not like you do not like always have to go against the platform, but you should have like some opinion about it, and then make sure that you are consistent with those opinions, because that would make your life easier, and anyone else that comes to use that data would benefit from it as well. And yeah, then make sure that you build things in a way that you either document your reporting, right? So if you're building a report, try to document why you're doing it and what the definitions are. And if you do it through BigQuery, if you use SQL or something of that sort, you make it reusable So, it's a query that other people can use and understand rather than, it's like something like very off the shelf. This is actually one of the common, arguments against using something like Excel, because it's hard to recreate the report again with like less time investment. But, this model is still sort of very useful. All right, awesome. Basically getting a lot of these streams of data, right? And then what you want to do is like have a purpose of that, that you can sort of use from it, right? So this is, I think, what's happening with like the data becoming so, like so readily available. We have a lot of this available, but what you really want to do is like focus it somewhere and then, get like the impact that you want out of it. And I think events is a great way to conceptually think of these like very foundational building blocks that will enable you to do this. Cool, and that's pretty much it. And this is me everywhere. If you need any advice, or I'm also on like the Measure Masters Facebook group as well. So if I can be of any help, or if you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to kind of hear them. Thank you.
All right, so there you have it. This is the event-driven analytics world. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comments down below. And in the description down below, we also have all the links that you might need in order to contact, for example, Hussain at Marketlytics, or check out our Measure Master program where we do these kind of live trainings every month. And if you haven't yet, you should definitely subscribe to our channel, as we bring you new videos just like this one every week. Now, my name is Julian. Till next time.